Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. On this program, we'd like to deal with the judgment by the High Court in Bulawayo that barred 12 of CCC's candidates from participating in the 2023 rat race. We've discussed it in the past, but we were only basing it on information we gleaned from the social media and so forth. We've managed to get hold of the High Court judgment itself. So I think it'll be very useful to go through it. And to help me go through it will be Benjamin. Benjamin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you for having me on the program, and to our viewers and listeners, thank you once again for coming through. We hope, like you said, this would actually, bring facts to the whole, as to the position of how we got to the CCC members being removed from the elections. So yeah, I think it would be very helpful to have facts than just speculating.
Okay, I'll read part of the document and maybe highlight the key points. So in this particular case, this is the most important thing. The applicants, this is reading directly the High Court judgment itself. The applicants are moving me to grant them a declared, however you pronounce it, and consequential relief. The premises of this application on the provisions of the Electoral Act, Chapter 2, Section 13, their bone of contention is that the Commission, which sat as the nomination court at the Bulawayo Magistrate Court, Trade Gold Building, on the 21st of June 2023, violated the law, in particular, Section 46, subsection 7 and 8 of the Act, when it accepted the respondent's nomination papers for election to members of the National House of Assembly of Zimbabwe in the election which are to be held on the 23rd of August 2023, after 1600 hours, and proceeded to sit to the early hours of 2022 June 2023. The important thing here is to emphasize the issue is on the accepted. In other words, ZEC accepted the respondent's nomination papers after 1600 hours. That is the issue. Accepting the nomination papers and accepting them after the time of closing. I don't know whether you have understood that bit, Ben.
Yes, it's pretty clear. If the Constitution is, and I think even the announcement was, and the times were given pre-hand to say this is the time length that you are supposed to try and get your papers all sorted out. And if for what the judgment says, that they only got the papers after 4 o'clock, which that day for me would definitely be something that is wrong. ZEC shouldn't have even accepted, because the nomination court should have closed. So yes, they did err for me on that. though speculation was saying that they arrived there before. If they had arrived there and they had given them before 4 o'clock, I think there would have been a state, a case. But if, and as it states that they handed over after 4 o'clock, I think that is unacceptable.
Well, that is the point that last time we were discussing, and to be quite honest, we actually didn't have the facts, the information itself, but now we do. In this particular case, what we've got to focus on is when was the nomination papers accepted by the nomination court. What time exactly was that accepted? That is important. If we establish that time and say, okay, was it after 4 o'clock? That is what is important here. Let me clarify another point. Another point here is it is understood, and this is not unique to the nomination process. It is actually common, even on election day. The ZEC officials are told, if you have got people in the queue, yeah, waiting to vote, you should allow them to vote. No one, take for instance the closing time, nomination or voting is supposed to stop at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, whatever time it is. You say, okay, at 6 o'clock, whoever is still in the queue should be allowed to vote. But no one can join the queue after that. Do you understand that bit?
Yes, that was the bit that I was trying to emphasize on our previous show, to say I'm not very well versed. Like I was saying, for example, you walk into TM and it's just about to close. I believe if you're in the shop, you have the right to pay for whatever you want and get your goods served, right? But uh, and now you have actually clarified that point to me, to say, if they were there in the line, then that would have been a different ballgame. So judging from that, then I think we have it kind of gives it a twist.
Right. In this particular case, that is what the rule says. And the judge does not dispute it. So the best person we can go to help us establish whether these people were in the queue before 4 o'clock and they were processed is, of course, the ZEC official himself. What I've got on the screen there is actually the ZEC official affidavits. And I can read part of it. ZEC filed its response through the affidavits of the first respondent and the affidavits of ZEC staffers who were on duty with the first respondent. The first respondent was the ZEC official on the day in question. ZEC denies the allegation by the applicant, the allegations that I've read at the beginning. The first respondent stated that he did not receive any nomination papers other than in terms of the law, i.e., between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. on nomination day, and did not adjourn the nomination court beyond the prescribed nomination day. The nomination court was very small and could accommodate between 12 to 15 people at a time. This is important. If you were queuing to submit your nomination papers, only 12 or 15 of you could be in the nomination court itself because the room was small. It could not accommodate everybody plus the officials who were processing. It could only take 12 or 15. So 12 people were allowed into the courtroom at a time to present their nomination papers. The balance would queue outside and wait their turn. That is perfectly understandable. It's perfectly normal. Now, this is the critical bit. At 15:55 hours, he instructed the police officer deployed at the nomination court to collect the nomination papers from all persons with nomination papers outside and bring them to him. This is the SEC official telling the police officer, okay, all these people who are still in the queue will take their nomination papers. If you can collect them and bring them to me. And the police officer complied and collected between 40 to 50 nomination papers and handed them to him. I'm reading what is on the screen. I think it will be very difficult for some people to read it unless they can expand it. At 4 p.m., he declared the court closed. He adjourned the court at 23:52 hours to seek guidance from the chief election officer on how to deal with the 4 nomination papers that were yet to be processed. So what he's saying there is the 40 or 50 nomination papers that they'd collected, remember, they are allowed to process them because they were in the queue before the official closing time. And that processing of those took them to about midnight of the day. And what they were trying to find out is, are they allowed to continue beyond? There were only 4 left at that time, just before midnight. And the chief election officer said to him, continue. That, I think, fixes the timetable. Just before 4 o'clock, there were still people who were in the courtroom and outside queuing to have their turn. As long as you were in the queue before 4 o'clock, you were allowed to stay in the queue and have your papers processed. What the SEC official did was to say to them, people who were in the queue, we will collect all your papers and we will process them. And he took them in to be processed. And in this particular case, the judgment does not say whether the nomination papers were taken in and the guys were allowed to stay outside. And when your papers are being processed, they were called in. It's not clear. But it looks like that was the case. Although they took all these papers in, when your paper was being processed, you were called in to have your papers processed. I don't know whether some of it will be to just clarify with you which constituents are you contesting or whatever. and to make sure that that is clear. And, you know, if there's a problem, for instance, if your nomination papers are not in order, they will tell you then that your nomination papers are not in order, so we cannot accept them. And this is the reason why we will not accept them. So I believe that the people were still outside and they were called in as their papers were now being processed. And just before midnight that night, they had not processed all the 40 or 50 that they'd collected. And so he checked whether he was allowed to go beyond the midnight in processing them. And the chief election officer said, go ahead. So even the chief election officer knew that this process, when you say you have closed at 4 o'clock, did not stop processing. You process those who were still in the queue beyond 4 o'clock. Do you understand that part of it, Ben?
Yes, I understand it completely. I think it's pretty clear. But as to how it's funny though, it's ironic to say, you know, the like Triple C had double candidates, and the double candidates made theirs on time, and then their candidates, the real candidates, were still trapped outside, and this is how they find themselves. But I think, you know, if you were there and it's just a situation where, you know, it's a slow process, and you know it takes maybe quite a long time to process each candidate. I mean, it's obvious you got to be verifying a lot of details, and you have to scrutinize and stuff like that. So I would understand that, you know, processing so many people, and also taking into consideration that there were double candidates, private candidates, ZANU-PF, CCC, MDCT, and all that, it does take a long time. So, but I firmly believe if they were there and they had been queuing, I mean, it's proper just to process everybody and not turn others away from such a great event like, you know, an election. It's something that happens after a long time, and it's of significant importance. So I firmly believe, yeah, it was right.
Well, in this particular case, the judgment actually confirms that there were other ZEC officials who also submitted their affidavits, and they confirmed what the first respondent, the chief, the main guy, the main ZEC guy on the night, and they confirmed those facts. And this is where we now come to his own analysis. And this is where it really becomes interesting, because what he's saying now is totally different. We revert to the facts. This is him, the judgment, in his judgment. I've been moved by the respondent, invariably all of them, save for the self-actor, that I accept the facts as pleaded by the first respondent. In other words, he's accepting as fact what the ZEC official affidavits, which I read just now, said. Then he is now analyzing it. And he's saying the first respondent stated in his affidavits that he only interacted with the individual respondents when they submitted their nomination papers. Annex B shows when each respondent submitted his or her nomination paper. Now, in his affidavits, the ZEC official had said part of the processing of these documents was that as you process them, there was a point where the secretary entered the nomination papers. And that's when the system captured as your nomination paper has been captured. It is important here to tell you that in this judgment that I've got, the attachment of Annex B is not there. So I cannot show it to you, but we can only speculate on what the document here says. First of all, the ZEC official says Annex B was being entered by a secretary to show when your documents were captured. So I will take it within this particular case. If he collected all the nomination papers at 15:55, and we're told there were 40 to 50 of them, even if we say he gave them to the secretary there and then to enter them into the system, there is no way she could have entered 40 to 50 documents to be captured before 4 o'clock, because it takes time. It's part of the processing. Otherwise, what's the point of collecting them at 4 o'clock when you're not going when you can't process them? Part of the processing them is capturing into the system. And there's no way he or she could have entered them into the system so that they're all entered into the system before 4 o'clock. They were collected before 4 o'clock. They were entered into the system. And what the judge is saying here is that the first respondent stated in his affidavits that he only interacted with the individual respondent when they submitted their nomination papers. And that was at 5 minutes to 4 o'clock, closing time. Annex B shows when each respondent submitted his or her nomination paper. This is where the time when the system captured it. And the judge then says, Annex B is a document compiled for public officials, by public officials during the course of their duty in service to the state. Long after 4 p.m., the majority of the respondent filed their nomination papers. The first respondent and his staff have said the time indicated in Annex B are not what they purport to be. In other words, ZEC officials are saying the time that is reflected in Annex B is the time when you enter them into the system. But that is not the time when we collected them from the candidates, prospective candidates. So to keep on insisting that the times shown in Annex B is the time when they were handed in, the nomination papers were handed in, is just being deliberately misleading. Because even the officials themselves tell you that is not the time we're talking about. We are allowed to process anyone who is still in the queue at 4 o'clock. After that, if you were not in the queue at 4 o'clock, you cannot join and we will not process you. But if you're going to process those people, that means we are now processing them after 4 o'clock. Just like the voting we're talking about, you are allowed to let those people who were in the queue at the time when officially you're saying we are stopping voting at 4 o'clock or 6 o'clock or whatever it is. But anyone who is in the queue at that time would be allowed to vote. So if we're going to say, well, you cast your vote after 6, you had to cast your vote after 6 because you were still in the queue. You could have been in the queue for the last 2 hours. It's just that the system itself could not process you quickly enough so that the last person is processed before 6 o'clock. If you are in the queue, you are allowed to be processed. That means you will cast your vote after 6. But this guy here, the judge, is insisting that the time when the system, your papers were captured by the system should be the time when they say your nomination papers were accepted. And therefore, then if you stick to that rule, obviously, all these people who submitted their nomination papers and they were in the queue at the time of closing at 4 o'clock will find their papers, their nomination papers, is being processed, is being captured by the system after 4 o'clock. That is the basis on which he is saying we should disqualify the people who went on to participate. Do you understand that bit, Ben?
Yes. So in simple terms, what this Annex B is, it's sort of like a receipt. After you have processed everything, and everything is okay. That's when you're entered into the system, I suppose, and given this Annex B is what comes out, which is sort of like a receipt to say you are now nominated and you are now a candidate for the upcoming election. So it obviously would be everybody. If there were 40 to 50 people that were still not yet processed, which would definitely mean that when you are processed, yes, it's when your papers have been verified and you are done with the processing, it is captured in the Annex B as done. I'm supposing that's how it's done, and then that's the receipt, and then it enters the time when you have actually been stated that you are processed. So given that day, I think I don't see why it was a problem in the first place. I don't see the problem.
Well, this is what he's saying. And in this particular case, he is now accusing the ZEC officials that in all probability, the first respondent comes up with this explanation, i.e. that the time of accepting the nomination papers is 1555 and not what the system captured it in Annex B. And he's saying, in all probability, the first respondent comes up with this explanation upon realizing that this application has put him and ZEC on trial. So he is basically saying, no, the time of capture in Annex B is the correct time, but you have now changed it. You are now arguing that it is the 1555 because you realize that ZEC is being put on trial here. I find it absolutely ridiculous that here is a judge, and this is not just a judge in some rural village. Here is a high court judge who acknowledges and accepts the fundamental rule that if you are in the queue at the time of closing, you will be allowed to have your papers processed. And somehow he expects Kuti anyone who was still in the queue, and in this case here, we are told there were 40 to 50 people still in the queue at 4 o'clock. Somehow, their nomination papers should have been captured by the system before 4 o'clock. It beggars belief. It's like saying on voting day, we allow those people who are still in the queue at the close of voting to continue voting, but they must cast their vote before the deadline. How is that possible?
It's weird. I mean, when you go on to, I was just going through, maybe I would have jumped the gun. You can go on maybe, and for the sake of the viewers, maybe you could continue explaining the part right to the bottom. It's shocking. It's disgraceful.
Oh, I mean, that is basically what you are saying here, that as far as you are concerned, the ZEC officials are deliberately trying to mislead people here. The time of capture by the system is the time the nomination papers were submitted, and all of them would show they were captured after 4 o'clock.
Because he is saying that, once 4 o'clock was done, they were now, the first respondent was now acting on his own, and, that the courts were already closed. So that would have stripped him possibly of the power that he had. But I mean, like you were saying, and I was saying, if you go into a shop and the time elapses, let's say for the time to close, it does not necessarily mean that when you sell the goods you're supposed to put the money in your pocket. Can you do that? No, you cannot. So you're still acting as an employee. I find it ridiculous. I think I just find it ridiculous.
Well, I mean, in this particular case, if the rule says that if you are not served by 4 o'clock, then you will not be served, that's fair enough. But if the rule says if you were in the queue, you will be served, it's just that you can't join the queue after the closing time.
Yes, I mean, you're supposed to take into consideration, this is a public thing, and there are a lot of people, and I do not know the time period it took to serve one person, but I'm pretty sure every paper has got its own different, some are not yet in order, they need to get sorted out, and so forth, and it's quite a process. And I
think this is why I read the bit when the first respondent, at just a few minutes before midnight, he called his superior to say, I still have got 4 nomination papers to be processed. Can I proceed beyond midnight? Because one can understand where they are saying, well, you do not want to encourage a situation where people can come in with their nomination papers the very last minute, and then the queue is 2 miles long, so that now processing them will take you 2 weeks. That's because they can say, I was in the queue. There is something one can say, it's got to be reasonable. If the people were still in the queue and you were still processing them up to midnight, yes, one can argue that that should be taken into consideration. But I think we are now getting out of the argument that the judge himself was looking at. What he was looking at was, when was the papers accepted? Was it 4 o'clock or was it after 4 o'clock? And what he's saying there is the um, the ZEC official is telling him, we collected, as the guidance says, if somebody is in the queue just before closing time, you tell them, okay, you are the last person who will be served. Anybody who comes from now on, they will not be served. But those people who are in the queue at that point, you say to them, we will serve you. But of course, you'll have to serve them beyond the 4 o'clock deadline. There's no other way. It totally becomes meaningless to say, oh, we will serve you beyond 4 o'clock, but you must be served by 4 o'clock. Well, how are you going to save 40 people? In this case here, he collected their papers with 5 minutes before 4 o'clock. Was he supposed to save all of them in that 5 minutes? You know, so it becomes ridiculous. It's like the voting we're talking about. If you're allowed, you were in the queue, you could have been in the queue for the last 6 hours.
I find it
but
very
you've not been
ridiculous.
able to vote. You are allowed to vote as long as you were in the queue before the deadline time. That is what the rule is saying. And in this particular case, what we've got to focus on is just focus on what the judge himself is saying was the cutoff time. He is now changing and saying, you collected these nomination papers just before 4 o'clock, but I'm not interested in that. I'm only interested in the time when they were captured by the system. But that's part of the processing, you know.
Yeah.
And it is ridiculous that somebody, a high court judge, would be so irrational.
I mean, he goes on to state in the third paragraph, the last sentence where he says the statute says that candidates or his agent must be in the court and ready to submit by 4 p.m. And it does not say that the candidate's papers alone must be in the courtroom. I mean, clearly, the first respondent, which is Zek, says that, the building was so small. And you're talking of 40 to 50 people that were still outside. And presuming if the people that are still outside, there were some people that were still inside. Because I don't see where there would be nobody in there and everybody outside. So it was still quite very busy inside and outside. And how do they want for everybody to go inside when it's clearly stated that? I find it's
I
a
think
mess.
we are really here on the rims of just somebody trying to be very pedantic. This is the kind of judgment that you can see trying to rewrite the rules and deliberately ignore even common sense, ignore even the facts on the ground. I mean, like you correctly said, insisting on, they must be in the courtroom. So if the courtroom was too small to accommodate only 12 or 15, tough luck. They say the courtroom was too small and the people, we allowed them to queue outside. And they were told, anyone who is still in the queue at 4 o'clock, you will be served. That was the rule. The ZEC official checked with his own supervisor.
Yeah,
when
and he was
processing was going beyond the 12 midnight.
Yes, he was. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. He was actually worried to say, this process is now going into the next day. What ought I to do? Report back to your superior, and then he was told to continue. Well, I think it was just a judgment that was
To be
already
quite
done and
honest,
dusted.
Benjamin, I can tell you now, I'll be surprised if this issue did not occur in every nomination court in the land.
Exactly.
Unless
I
you
would
are
agree with you. I would agree with you. I would very
Unless you
much
had a
agree with you.
situation where you had people who had submitted their nomination papers, they'd been processed, and there was no one anyone in the queue at the close of time. And then you say, okay, this is the closing time. There's nobody in the queue, which is not unusual. It is possible. I mean, it's like I say, I keep referring to voting day. If you were in a polling station, some polling station would have a situation where maybe the first 2 hours, people come in trickles, where
Yeah, it's early
you
morning.
there's no queue at all. You just, as you arrive, you go straight in, you get your process, you cast your vote, and then there's nobody there, and they're twiddling their thumbs and so forth. And then two or four more people come in, and then the number of people coming to vote may start to increase, and then you start having queuing. And by the time you're getting towards closing time, it may turn into a trickle, and then there's no one there. And at closing time, you say, okay, this is the deadline. That's it. That's fine. But there will be some stations where at closing time, there is still people in the queue.
People, yes.
So I would be surprised if somebody was to do a thorough research here to find there were a number of nomination courts
that were open. I've seen a couple. I just did not want to work with something that is not factual, but some polling stations are also saying, some even in Mashonaland, as far as Mashonaland, I don't remember which part, that were saying that there were number of nomination candidates that were still being processed. So should we close those two? I think this is just irrational. And well, this is a system that we are faced with. This is the system that we are dealing with.
This particular case is not the system. I think it is important to understand here that this is a judiciary that is deliberately giving, if the judgment was going to affect.
But under an instruction, I mean, it's obvious it's under an instruction. When you're looking at a day-to-day basis, I'm sure they know Zimbabwean queues, how it works, and it shouldn't be surprising to him that this is what happened. And also taking into consideration that there were double candidates in this place, so which means that it actually extended the usual number. And funny enough, all the double candidates got processed, all right, which is very ironic.
Well, in this particular case, I think the High Court judgment is absolutely ridiculous. You really expect this kind of mediocre performance in a kangaroo court, not in a high court. Even some of the low down courts of the land, you'd expect to have some degree of common sense. But to see a judgment like this being given, an argument like this being given by a high court judge, it really shows how far we've gone down. We really have become a banana republic with kangaroo courts. If ZANU-PF officials or candidates were involved, this would have never happened. To be quite honest, I don't expect it to happen to anybody. And I don't expect a high court judge to give such a ridiculously pathetic argument. But that is the extent to which the country has drifted. And that is the tragedy of Zimbabwe. And it must be emphasized here as well that the opposition have known about the pathetic situation with our judiciary. They are as much responsible for this situation by keeping on participating in a process that is so flawed, that is so ridiculous. How many times have you and me heard Ben here and then we've talked about it, where the police are doing the same thing? You go there as a victim of political violence. If you're ZANU PF, they'll listen to you. If you're the opposition, even if you're the victim, you could end up spending the night in the cell. That is how ridiculous our political our state institutions have become. They've been so politicized, so captured to the point where they are utterly useless. Then the question is, why is the opposition keeping on participating and giving the process legitimacy? This is what I can't understand, Ben.
I've also asked the same question to say, what exactly is the opposition driven by? And we discussed yesterday, and I was actually thinking to myself, there's a lot of cases. God knows there's a lot of cases, of that we have seen, and it took such an event for them to say, okay, we are going to boycott, because now there's a risk, not just only of losing some parliamentary seats, but there's also risk of losing, the money that comes with it. And that was an eye opener to them to see that this here election is a farce. So then you wonder what is the motivation behind this. Is this truly to help people? No, I don't think so, because people are getting beaten, but they're still saying, let's go for elections, we are going to win big. People are getting frog marched in the rural areas. No, let's go, we are going to win big. Until it had something to do with the pocket, then the opposition said, no, 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 enough is enough. And I think that is wrong. On the first matter we should have taken, there is no verified voters roll, but they were willing to go without it. And yet this is what is supposed to be the most important document of an election. So now you have to question, the ulterior motive behind Triple C itself. Of course, this is not supposed to be done, but they themselves, I don't think I would wipe them clean to say, this is the best. And I've always said, I don't think Triple C is a solution to our problems, because they are willing to go regardless of the evidence that these elections are rigged. ZANU PF is forcing people to do what they do not want. They are still willing to continue with these elections until they risk something that would affect their pockets. Then they said they started to raise their heads. And I think that is very unfair. And we must see that they as a fact that this is what these guys are up to.
Yeah, it is. It really is disappointing. I have to admit it. Absolutely disappointing. We can't keep on carrying on with this circus. It's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Why Triple C keep on participating is, yes, I totally agree. It's out of greed. Period. We can't pretend it is anything else. And we'll just finish this discussion with this what you call it, Twitter, that was posted by Nelson Chamisa. I don't know whether you've seen it, Ben.
Yes, I have seen it, but I think it was a bit too far-fetched. I don't know what it's meant to subscribe, but I don't think it was necessary. I think the wedding, he could have chosen his wedding much better.
Well, that is what the wedding he chose, and we've got to deal with that. And I think it is important to really, be open and frank about this. ED is just about to plunge Zimbabwe into an unprecedented electoral and national crisis. Never target a tribe or victimize a region twice. To be quite honest, when I saw that, I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe it. We have got to understand that ZANU-PF has plunged the country into electoral and national crisis on a number of occasions. Political, economic, social, and so forth. And to pretend that the failure to get his 12 MPs to participate is equivalent to some of the crises that the regime has plunged the country into, I think is stretching the imagination there. The country has been plunged into a political crisis when Mnangagwa himself led the electoral coup in 2008, which then led to the runoff, in which the country was plunged into the worst electoral violence that we have ever seen. And then Mnangagwa was involved in the 2017 military coup. And to pretend somehow this fiasco of 12 of his MPs being denied the vote is comparable to those political crises. And then we can talk about social and other economic crises. That the crisis of the hyperinflation and so forth. I think it beggars belief. But I don't know whether you want to talk about that, the second part of it. Never target a tribe or victimize a region twice. What do you think of that one?
No, I think it was just a low blow. I think he didn't really have to. I think he was trying to stir up something, and for me, I think it was a bit shallow for him to go there. And I really don't want to comment about it. It's just disturbing that he went that low. I think if it was in sports, we would have said he's not a sportsman. I don't think you use that just because of just it's I can't explain what he was thinking when he did this. I think it was just shallow of him to go there. And being a political games, I believe it's okay for you just to whatever, but this, it's not right.
Well, in this particular case, the courts being captured and coming up with a really ridiculous judgment like that has got to be denounced, and it doesn't matter where it happened. It just happened in Bulawayo. But I think actually, like I said, if somebody was to carry out a proper research, I can tell you now that many of the candidates who are on the ballot paper now would have been captured by the system after the nomination closing time of 4 o'clock, because they were allowed to process anyone who was still in the queue. And to keep on changing the goalposts is typical of this kangaroo judiciary. And instead of addressing it in that visionary way, he is now trying to narrow it down into it must be because he was trying to target the people in Matabeleland, in Bulawayo. I think it's ridiculous. And I have got to denounce also this tendency by our politicians whenever they are finding themselves in a situation where they cannot compete. They always look for issues that somehow boost their own image by addressing issues which, even if they are remote, they are not even remotely related. Because this issue of the High Court giving a ridiculous judgment is not unique to a region or to a tribe. It just so happened that it happened in Bulawayo. And in this particular case, I think you actually touched on it as well, that we cannot pretend that the opposition, the way they handled their nomination papers was chaotic, to say the least. That has got nothing to do with tribe. In this case here, they could have actually missed the deadline. They did not. And we are only looking at the facts. And we cannot blame CCC for handing in their papers, even if they were in the queue 5 minutes before. They were in the queue. And if the issue was they handed their papers before 4 o'clock, then it must be decided on that basis and that basis alone. What would have delayed the CCC candidates is another matter. It's a discussion for another matter. When we're talking about this High Court judgment, we base it on the facts that the judge himself admitted. And for him to do a complete flip and come up with something else is totally unacceptable. But for the CCC leader to now try to turn it into a tribal or regional issue is pathetic. This is the same opposition leaders who failed to implement even one meaningful democratic reform when they had the golden opportunity to do so. And that is what landed us into this mess. And I don't know what he's trying to play at here to enhance his own image by playing this tribal and regional card. It's ridiculous and it should be condemned. Let's solve the nation's political and social and political problems without having to resort to cheap politics. Is he trying to suggest here that targeting a tribe or a region once is okay? Ridiculous. No one should ever be targeted in any way. It should be condemned. Whether it happened twice, once, it should have never happened in the first place. We must condemn the opposition. And I honestly think one of the problems we are in this mess is not only that we have got ZANU-PF, a tyrannical, corrupt and tyrannical regime that has corrupted all our institutions, including the judiciary. But we also have a problem with our opposition, who are opportunists. They failed to implement the reforms. And now they are the ones who are participating in these flawed elections for the sake of winning a few seats He is the one who has been claiming that he has plugged all the holes. SANU-PF will not rig these elections. CCC is winning big. And yet, day in, day out, we are finding all these problems. If he had plugged all the holes, why didn't he plug the holes of the judiciary? This would have not happened then. So he didn't plug all the holes. The other day we were talking about the flaws in the voters' roll. So he didn't plug the holes in the voters' roll. We are going into the election in about 3 weeks, and ZANU-PF is rigging these elections. And the same political opportunists who are telling us they are winning big will be the ones telling us the elections were rigged. I think we need to learn and move away from this madness. If we're going to condemn these elections, we should condemn them now. We should condemn the opposition for participating in them to give the process legitimacy. And we should condemn it now and not have to wait until the 24th of August when the results are coming in and it will be too late. Condemn it now. That is my final advice to you. Thanks very much, Benjamin. Do you want to give your final remarks?
Thank you. I think you have poured your heart out, and I think you've done justice to it. Thank you to our viewers. Words of wisdom from Mr. Mukore. I think they are very, very good if you choose to listen to them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Benjamin, and we'll meet tomorrow. And I'm sure as long as we have got these elections, there will be plenty to talk about.
Oh yes, it's always drama after drama, and
oh yeah,
sometimes it's a bit draining. Sometimes it's always fun, so you never know what to expect. See you tomorrow, viewers. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I mean, the tragedy is that if we were to have another rigged election and another 5 years of this failed state, that is a tragedy that we could have avoided. And I think that is what concerns me the most. Thanks again, Benjamin, and good night.
Good night. Thank you.